The Books Podcast, presented by Tim Haig.
Welcome to the 100th edition of the Books Podcast. Now, in that century of interviews, we've had a fairly dazzling back catalogue of authors, and I know that you guys dig back through the site and check them out, so thank you for that. Who have I not mentioned recently? Let's see, we've had Russell Hoban, Toby Litt, Salman Rushdie, many more. And if you haven't yet subscribed, remember it's free. In this episode, we're delighted to be talking via Zoom to Simon Hart.
Michael Dobbs wrote House of Cards, and it's obviously fiction, but it's probably close to the fact that even Michael was anticipating. We went from unassailable in 2019 to unelectable in 2024. Unless we ask ourselves honestly, how the hell did that happen? Then I don't think we will necessarily learn the lessons of that.
I ask you, gentlemen of the jury, is this the kind of book you'd like your wives and servants to read?
Simon, thank you so much for joining us on Books Podcast.
Oh, no problem.
Cards on the table. I absolutely love political diaries. At least I do if they're sort of lively and well written, which is to say I really enjoyed Ungovernable. Great title, by the way. I have to say, it's subtitled Political Diaries of a Chief Whip. We don't usually see first-hand accounts from chief whips, do we? Why is that?
No, and I think therein lies a bit of a controversy with which not everybody, it doesn't sit comfortably with everybody, because there is a bit of an ancient custom in Parliament that, whips don't write books, and without necessarily much explanation which goes with that. So it is to some extent breaking the code. But I hope I've done it in a way which is thought-provoking, occasionally challenging, but also, with a twinkle in the eye from time to time. It's just been such an interesting and tumultuous couple of years that anything which records what was going on in the background may one day, be helpful to people who are interested in this kind of thing.
Well, I would think so. I mean, part of the reason might be that chief whips are, I don't want to use the word obscure, but they're not usually the best known member of the government, are they? At risk of causing you to blush, I don't suppose Simon Hart is exactly a household name. I had to look up. I had to Google who was your predecessor. I even had to Google who the current chief whip is. So in a way, that's a possible reason, but there is actually a really interesting story to tell, because I suspect quite a lot of people don't really know what a chief whip does. So can we look into that for a moment? Can we just
and I think that's sort of been partly by design over the years. Most people never heard of who the chief whip is, let alone what the chief whip does, until Michael Dobbs came along and wrote House of Cards back in the 80s or 90s, whatever it was, and then which was subsequently picked up and run with by Netflix.
And they did an American version, didn't they?
Yeah, and so that sort of that created a bit of interest in the role and the title, and it's obviously fiction, but it's probably closer to fact in some respects than even Michael was anticipating at the time that he wrote it. And but I think the reason for sort of coming out of the shadows a bit is that because public frustration with politics has been, I think, building slowly over the years, or maybe quickly, and the knowledge of actually the complexities of what goes on in there, and actually some of the very human stories. It is a big workplace. 650 MPs drawn from across the British Isles by a sort of ancient democratic process, thousands of staff members, working this extraordinary sort of UNESCO World Heritage Site. This is a story of, human ambition as well as human failure. And it's meant to, I hope, in part, I hope it's an illustration that government, whoever's in power, this is not about the Conservatives, this is about everybody, is difficult and unpredictable and passionate. And it's, and I'm not sure that that's been written about recently.
Well, I think you probably have a point. And of course, one of the things that the chief whip deals with are the stories that later get into the press. And you're very funny on on that, because every so often there'll be there's a wonderful passage on in 22 when you get a call at 2:45 in the morning.
Even though I've tried to apply a bit of a light-hearted style to that, actually, it's not about comedy. It's tragedy rather than comedy, I think. And it raises the question of, how on earth are we, training, supporting, selecting MPs in the way that is, best prepares them for the extraordinary life in Westminster. And what we shouldn't be doing, I don't think, as a whip's office and in the role of the chief whip, is simply, picking people up from their latest disaster which might have befallen them and sending them on their way. Although that, I used to get frustrated. That did seem what it felt like we were doing a lot of the time. Actually, I don't think we were particularly adept at making sure that we were preparing people for this extraordinary life in a way that actually ends up with them not having to ring me at 2:45 in the morning. By the time they ring me at 2:45 in the morning from some, dubious establishment in Bayswater, the damage is done. It's too late. Neither do I think we should have been, the department for covering up. Actually, our job was to try and get the government's business done, not to dig people out of, as I say, some hole they dug themselves and in the middle of the night. And I think that's a symptom of failure.
That's true, but you don't half get a bunch of nutters as well. I mean, I wasn't going to move on to this yet, but I've got a sort of cast list of some of the and Conservative MPs. So there are crazy ones in every party, of course there are. But I have to start off with Suella. I love Suella. She's fab. The very first time we meet her in your book, you describe her as over-promoted when she first made it into the cabinet. I think she was International Development Secretary or something, wasn't she? Later on, when she's in a rarefied position, you reference the ever-present headache that is the Home Secretary.
I think what I'm trying to do, this is a diary. It's how I felt on the day. It probably mightn't be how I felt the day before or the day after. And when I look back at it, I thought, gosh, there are bits of this I might have written differently. If this was a memoir, I'd have definitely written it differently. But I wanted to be faithful to the concept of a diary being exactly that. And it's fair to say that in a workplace of 650 MPs and all of the staff and sort of advisors to go with that, not everybody gets on with everybody else. There are tensions, there are differences of opinion, and I suspect Suella's probably got a much more fiery description of her thoughts on me than I have.
Well, I dare say,
and that's fine. And I learned to respect Suella and not to underestimate her. Well, were we ever mates? No. Was I exasperated? What I exasperated, yes. And actually, the then Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, was always very good at sort of, taking me to one side and sort of, and giving me advice about just, step away from the heat a bit and just, remind yourself what we're trying to do here. And that was always quite useful. And, but yeah, I don't, I don't think Suella and I will ever be best mates, but we found a way. We found a way of, sort of muddling along as best we could. And, but it was difficult. It wasn't easy.
Yeah, and as Chief Whip, of course, you do get to see a lot of the Prime Minister, don't you? You get to be quite close. You evidently got on with Rishi and had a lot of time for him. You Rishi Sunak, I should probably say, especially for our foreign listeners, because about a third of our listeners are in North America. So Rishi Sunak, who was the Prime Minister for whom you served as Chief Whip. But you clearly had a lot of time for him. His predecessors had perhaps been... let's think of loose cannons, shall we say? So, he must have been a breath of fresh air.
I mean, I supported Rishi. I always thought, incredibly highly of him because he was an astonishingly hard worker. He was he had a genuine belief in public service, still does, and he. If ever there was an example of somebody who relentlessly, did the right thing for the right reason, it was him. I did, by the way, you talk about the sort of proximity between the chief whip and the PM. I always took the view that if the PM and I had to have a conversation, that meant something had gone wrong, and that it was a
So
sign
you
of,
saw him every day, or what?
it was a sign of my job was to act as a lightning conductor for him. I'd see him in a general meeting most mornings, just to give a quick update on where we were on sort of legislation and stuff like that. But by and large, our job was to say keep the difficult headaches and the sort of managerial stuff out of his out of his office desk, so that he could deal with the big stuff.
One of the stories you tell is that on your very first day, Matt Hancock called you to say, "Oh, can I have some time off?" Why? And he said, "Well, I want to go on it. I'm a celebrity." And you said, "Well, I'll ask number 10." But by the time number 10 had got back to you to say no, he was already on the flight.
I think he'd already gone. And Matt is one of those people who are. It is actually, people might be surprised with. He's impossible not to have affection for. He's extraordinarily upbeat about pretty well everything. In a job at that time, well, before that, and during the pandemic when he was health secretary, in a job which, where a lot of things were going wrong simultaneously. I thought he dealt with the pressure of that. He never missed a beat on that, and it was the example of him going to Australia was interesting because, of course, it just did also highlight that the limitations of the whip's office. We didn't have we only had really one sanction. Didn't matter which was the removal of the whip, which basically rendered you no longer a member of your party, and so you could still stand as an independent, but you couldn't stand in an election, for example, as a Conservative if you'd had the whip removed. And that was the same penalty if you'd been involved with taking Class A drugs as it is for if you wanted to go on I'm a Celebrity. So it was a bit of a clunky one-size-fits-all tool, and of the many things I wish we could do differently, having a more sophisticated sort of sanction regime for MPs who fall foul of the system would be a step forward, I think.
Well, I do wonder, because a large part of the job of the chief whip is to help get the government through. And did you not, as chief whip, find it annoying that there were sort of parties within parties, the ERG, the European Research Group, or the No Turning Back Group, who seems to be working to frustrate party business?
Yeah, and I think you're right. Principal job of the whip's office to get the business of the government done, to get the legislation through both the Commons and the Lords, and that is our sort of raison d'être. You're right, and I think it became more frustrating the deeper into all of this we got. That we had been in office for 13 or 14 years. Rishi Sunak was doing his level best to get a sort of positive economic message across to the nation, but there was an awful lot of background noise, and that background noise was difficult to get heard above from time to time, and it was, it might have been about a rebellion against a piece of legislation. It might have been an alternative leadership bid. It might have been a defection to another party, or just quite noisy threats being made by different groups of one sort or another. And our job was to try and get everybody over the line into the right lobby at the right time in support of the government. And we did that on all but one occasion. We intensely annoyingly lost one vote. And we knew we knew all along that 2024 was going to be an election year. So we knew that, public confidence in us had been stretched towards the end of Boris's regime because of the issue of Partygate. Whether we agree with it or not is a different matter. And we knew by the time Liz had completed her quite short term in number 10 that the public confidence in us as a responsible guardian of the economy had also taken a big hit. So we were, we couldn't afford any mistakes. We couldn't afford to impart an impression of disunity or dysfunction to the electorate. If we had any chance at all of winning an election in that year, it required steely self-discipline and united behaviour. And so when one group or another, went into central lobby and started saying that they were going to threaten the government with a rebellion. That was extremely counterproductive. In our general ambition, was that nobody had ever won a fifth term, and I don't think ever in the history of Parliament, that was a really, really big ask. If everything had been going well, it's an even bigger ask when not everything is going well. And so everybody knew. I mean, it wasn't a great secret that to get into contention to do that required a superhuman effort. But by then, people were. We were 20 points behind in the polls. We'd been in that place for a long time. I think people were feeling like it wasn't going to work and that their time in Parliament was over. And
well, it gives them a license, doesn't it? If you're convinced that you're going to lose the election, there's no real incentive to cooperate with the whips to support the Prime Minister.
I mean, why not go on that foreign trip? Why not vote with the opposition? Why not join a rebel army? Why not support an alternative leadership bid or whatever it might be? You're probably not going to get the job in cabinet or in government that you fancied. You're probably not going to get the honour that you coveted or whatever.
One of your alternative titles for this book was About My Knighthood, which a phrase you heard a lot.
Those were all things. That's right, and those were all things which contributed to the fact that it became very, very difficult to hold the ship together as we approached the middle of 2024.
You mentioned Liz Truss. Before she becomes leader, there's a quote in the book: "Works like a horse, but is a little quirky, to say the least." Well, yeah, quirky as a hatter, I would have said. But you've got a prescient observation before she becomes leader. And you, in the diary, say, what would a Truss government look like? Would it even last? Well, no. So my question isn't, now the membership put lettuce Liz into the leadership. Didn't the entire Conservative Parliamentary Party realise that it was a disaster?
Well, I think we were still reeling, if you remember, from the sort of the Boris Johnson, the final fall of Boris Johnson. So there was a lot of anger and frustration knocking around, and people were not necessarily voting in a way that they would have done had this just been a straightforward leadership battle, if there is such a thing as a normal leadership battle. And there were those who, wrongly, by the way, assigned sort of Boris's downfall to Rishi. I don't think that was fair.
Oh, no, not at all.
Then it's not fair now.
I assign it to Boris.
So, that was made it difficult for Rishi to clean up all of the votes he needed to win that first time round. He won second time round, but to get over the line first time round was difficult against that background noise of had he played a part in the decapitation of Boris. And I think that was unfair, but it might have had an impact on the result. And I suppose MPs, I remember feeling rather sort of rather self-entitled and grand myself at the time, because I was thinking, well, hang on a minute, the MPs work alongside and with the leadership candidates every day of every week. We sort of know what their quirks are, we know what their strengths are, and therefore, we think that we're probably as well placed as any to make a choice as to which one is the most appropriate leader for that particular time, part in the political cycle. And so it was frustrating that the choice that the members of Parliament made was sort of overruled by the choice that the members of the party made. And that did raise questions at the time. I remember it about, actually, is this a good system? Should it be the other way around? Should the party members come up with the shortlist and then the MPs decide which of the sort of final four they think should go forward to be leader? Those questions remain unresolved. But the one thing is for sure, and is indisputable, that we, first say, for whether it's justified or not, we slipped to a 20-point deficit in the polls about 2 or 3 weeks into Liz's regime, and we never recovered from that. It never really, to be honest, I don't think it ever changed. I think it might have gone up one or two, down one or two, but it sort of didn't matter what Rishi said or did, good or bad. The nation had just by then decided that it was somebody else's turn. And when the nation has reached a point like that, it's like a glass ceiling. You don't know you've reached it till you hit it. And we hit it, and we couldn't shift it. And that's why we lost in 2024. It wasn't because Rishi went in July, not October.
No,
it was
of course.
No. The nation had made its mind up a long time before.
Do you think it had made its mind up before Liz? I mean, again, another quote: "What the Boris years had done for our reputation for integrity, Liz had now repeated in terms of her economic competence." Was Liz Truss the deciding factor? If you had been able to get Rishi in after Boris, was there a fighting chance?
Well, who knows? I think what we would have avoided then, I think, is that collapse of economic competence and the market panic, which resulted in those sort of chaotic days when we around the time of the mini budget. All of that would have been avoided. Therefore, our reputation for economic competence may have remained intact for longer. So I do, that's with the benefit of hindsight. Who knows for sure what the outcome would have looked like then. But so I think, by the time Boris left, I think we were about 5 points behind. And then by the time Liz left, we were 20 points behind. But I don't think it doesn't really follow necessarily that Liz was responsible for the 15. I actually think that the public had, there was a bit of a final straw moment. So when it went to 20 points behind, it was more a reflection of everything and everybody rather than just Liz or just Boris. It was just overall exasperation that we had, the joke had worn a bit thin. We were no longer to be relied upon as the bastions of integrity or economic competence. And once that mindset has been, when people have decided, they've eventually said, do you know what, I've had enough of this. Yeah, it's very difficult to come back from that.
Well, let me put to you a couple of other elements, though. There are a couple of controversial things that you say in the book, which I'd like a response on. Partygate. At one point, I think in 2020, just after the Sue Gray report, you say the press blew Partygate out of all proportion. Really? You think it was?
Well, at the time,
overplayed.
I remember at the time thinking that, I literally remember this when the story first broke, thinking it wasn't a massive deal. Who doesn't, reach for a, warm bottle of cheap wine at the end of a long day and pour it into a paper cup and have a swig before going home, sort of thing. I remember thinking that.
Mm-hmm.
And I used to think to myself, well, we're in the workplace. We're entitled to be in the workplace. We are working alongside other colleagues, subject to the regulations. What's the difference between having a cup of coffee or a glass of wine? So that was how it came across to me at the time, that was all it was. Now, I was wrong, as history then revealed, because I didn't know at the time what we know now, which was it was a rather more organised and formalised affair than just, as I say, just a swig of wine from the bottom drawer before jumping on the...
Yeah, but wasn't there a Westminster bubble effect as well, that you sort of discounted or not you necessarily, but the Westminster bubble discounted the people who couldn't visit their dying mother in the hospice and couldn't go to a funeral. I mean, the Queen at Prince Philip's funeral was
correct
a landmark image,
yes,
which sort of drew attention to.
I think it changed
the looseness
everything.
yeah.
I think it changed everything. So I think in the same way as I think right at the very, very early signs of the pandemic, I remember, we were just getting wind of this virulent strain of flu originating, it was claimed, in China at the time. And I remember our initial I remember our initial reaction to it is, yeah, we get these from time to time. There's always, there's quite often a sort of a new strain of flu. It comes, it goes, and not thinking that it was necessarily going to progress and develop into the international drama that it became. In those early days, we didn't anticipate that, and we didn't know. And I don't blame anybody. I don't think anybody knew.
Oh no, me too. I think that the Conservative government got actually a lot of stick for things that that were reasonable. When they set up that enormous that hospital in the Excel, which never got used, and some people said it was a scandalous waste of money. It wasn't. It was a reasonable precaution. Some of the other things that
it would have been an even bigger scandal if we hadn't had capacity to hospitalise people, and they would have been be treated in the wrong circumstances. So we had to. I mean, I will defend the government, to my dying day on that. That was the right thing to do.
It was. Eat out to help out, on the other hand, not such a brilliant policy.
Well, again, I don't. We just have to. We can all look back now with the benefit of hindsight and say, well, it was that did that way. At the time, there was no suggestion that that particular measure came with a health risk. We had top-class advice from people like Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance. I don't remember them saying that this was a reckless policy and that we shouldn't be doing it. But I remember very clearly on one occasion the excellent Chris Whitty saying that don't forget that a collapse of the economy will kill more people than COVID will. And it was a very considered and thoughtful thought, that, because he's right that an economy which literally falls apart triggers all sorts of disasters for families and individuals who will then suffer or could suffer and die in other areas of the health regime as a result of that. So trying to keep and revive the economy was an essential part of the national health, small h national health mission at the time. So, and I remember when it was announced in Parliament by Rishi Sunak to widespread. There was no resistance at the time, either from the medical experts or from politicians. But okay, subsequently, people began to ask, "Oh, maybe that actually contributed." I think it was a very considered judgment at the time.
Well, it's hard to say, but my daughter and I went out a lot to eat that month. Yeah, this is the advantage of Diaries, though, isn't it? That you get the contemporary moment, you get a contemporary response. I want to do just one more controversial, if that's okay. It's the return of David Cameron, who was brought back to be Foreign Secretary. Now, you say in the diary it was an inspired move, and I think that many people still think so. It was. You say it was a good operation. It certainly was. It was kept secret, and Cameron was rapidly ennobled. But I have to say, it looked to me like sleaze. The Lex Greensill business was still fresh in my mind. What was the thinking there? Did we decide that sleaze didn't matter anymore?
No, I mean, we're talking about Rishi Sunak here. He is not somebody who was blasé about standards or that kind of thing. So he would have never have gone near any of these things if he thought there was a sort of probity issue. And for anybody to be appointed to government, or indeed the House of Lords for that matter, there has to be an independent and fairly sort of deep-rooted scrutiny of their financial background and all of that. So that David Cameron would not have gone anywhere near this role if he hadn't been cleared by at least two sort of, for the sake of argument, regulatory bodies. And so this is not a case of, some mucker in number 10 sort of giving him the job via the back door. He went through all of the scrutiny necessary for any minister and would have been signed off as fit to appoint before any of that happened.
And, in terms of the Conservative Party at the time, he was a talent. So he
I mean, the message that it imparted, I think at the time was, if we can attract a big beast back out of the wilderness into our ranks to pick up one of the most important policy areas that any government has to contend with, then that spoke volumes. It meant we weren't finished yet.
I want to go back to the book just because, after all, it is all about the book. How did you decide what to be discreet about? Because there's a really good-natured feel to this book. You don't, on the whole, want to drop anybody in it, but on the other hand, you don't feel necessarily that you should protect people from their idiocies.
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of absolutely key question because I'm well aware. And people reminded me of there's a sort of unwritten rule that some things just should always remain undiscussed or Whip's office rules apply and all that. I take a different view, and the reason I take a different view is because from a Conservative Party point of view, we went from unassailable in 2019 to unelectable in 2024 through three very different prime ministers. Unless we ask ourselves honestly, look in the mirror and say, how the hell did that happen? Then I don't think we will necessarily learn the lessons of that things. And I think that one of the reasons I've done this is, to ask some quite difficult questions of ourselves, including me. I don't exempt myself from any of this, by the way. And because I think if we do that, we've got a better chance of getting our candidate selection process in order. I think we've got a better chance of making sure that MPs are properly supported, mentored, trained in their early careers and right the way through to their ministerial careers. And I think unless we do that, restoring public confidence is going to be a long and difficult job. So, I've tried to avoid naming people unnecessarily. I've tried to avoid making people whose lives are complicated enough even more complicated. But I've also just, I hope in a rather more sort of gentle tease rather than, knife in the chest type move, just to explain just how difficult it was if you're Prime Minister, or in my case, Chief Whip, constantly battling these headwinds all the time, every day, and trying to get heard above that as a party in its 14th year, trying to get its fifth term of government. That was, part of the purpose of this book. I say that is not easy.
And of course, it was an ignominious defeat. So, yes, in fact, everything you've just been saying is summed up in a note you make at the end of the book. What remains important, you say, is to salvage what we can, behave with honour and integrity, form a decent opposition, elect a sane and sensible leader, and start again. How would you say that was going?
Well, I actually think it's going better than a lot of people anticipated at the time. And I think that I had a bloody hard job, mind you. And I think Kemi Badenoch is, to be fair, I wouldn't have done it. To pick up the mantle and sort of try to put the pieces of the party back together, not just the MPs, it's the membership, and also to restore confidence with voters that, we can return as a force to be reckoned with. That's difficult. And I think there's been a lot of temptations to try and, out-Lib Dem the Lib Dems, or out-reform reform, or whatever the expression might be. And I think she's been quite wise not to be tempted down that quite sort of expedient route, and has basically adopted, well, this is what we stand for, this is what I stand for, you either believe it or you don't. And I think that's a sort of quite a commendable approach to this difficult situation. So as I say, I think there were those who thought the whole thing would literally crash and burn. It hasn't. So far so good.
Well, you say you wouldn't have done it. Of course, you didn't. You were voted out in the last general election. Although, to be fair, your constituency was abolished, so it's not really a rejection of you as an MP so much as a Tory government.
By the way, I think that's the case in every constituency. People always think that they have a sort of bigger influence on the actual vote than they do. Most voters vote for a party; they don't vote for an individual.
And you weren't offered a peerage or a knighthood or anything?
No, well, I tell you what. In the book, I've made quite a thing about the fact that honours are something that should be the gift of the leader or the prime minister, whatever it might be. They should never be something that anybody assumes as an automatic right. And it used to annoy me a bit that there were one or two people sort of, just thought because they'd been in Parliament 20 years, they automatically qualified. It's not really like that. And that occasionally, so I would be even more hypocritical than I probably am already if I was to suddenly say, yes, it's a sort of, should come around with a ration. I mean, I've done my 15 years, and what happens next is definitely not in my gift.
Oh, but you've written a terrific book about it, so that's almost worth the trouble.
Well, I hope, as I say, although it will ruffle some feathers, I do hope it's also thought-provoking as well as just having its light-hearted moments, because that makes it readable,
Oh, yes. And it is extremely readable. The book is Ungovernable, The Political Diaries of a Chief Whip by Simon Hart. It's published by Macmillan at £25, and it's enormous fun. Simon, thank you so much for joining us on Books Podcast.
Thanks so much. Take care.
If you enjoyed this interview, please subscribe for free on your favourite podcast player to be notified of upcoming episodes. For our next show, we'll be with Ian Leslie discussing his forthcoming book on the relationship between Lennon and McCartney, entitled John and Paul, A Love Story in Songs. Regular listeners will know that I'm a bit of a Beatles anorak, so I can't wait for that. We'll see you then.
That was the Books Podcast, presented by Tim Hague. Email Tim on tim@bookspodcast.com, Twitter @bookspodcast, and Facebook @bookspodcasttim.